TXNORML please raise their hands? Everybody take a look at those folks. Come up to us afterwards, talk to us, get involved. We've got plenty of ways for you to help if this is your sort of thing. Go ahead and raise your hand if tonight is your first meeting. See a couple of over here. We love newbies. And you're going to love this so much, you're going to come back and you're going to get to talk to the newbies next month and the month after that. I imagine most of the new folks already know this, but of course NORML's mission is to move public opinion sufficiently to legalize the responsible use of marijuana by adults. I'm fond of saying that mission has really been accomplished. I'd really like to remind people, and it's a good talking point since we've got the legislative session coming up. If you're going to go talk to have meaning to you, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview right now and just tell you that we really had a really good Supreme Court term. Typically the Supreme Court works like this. The government goes in and asks that a lot of the unfair, unreasonable, illogical things that they've been asking for and doing, that those things be upheld, and for the most part this term the Supreme Court struck them down. So we're moving in the right direction when it comes to our military state as well, which is part of the overall war on drugs. Tonight, our featured speaker is going to be Kevin Ludlow. He, libertarian candidate. He's going to come up here and regale us with his thoughts, feelings, emotions on various subjects. I look forward to that. Also, our executive director, Jax Finkel, is going to talk to us about membership and upcoming events, I believe. Dave Winnicky, another board member, is having a mystery presentation for a few minutes. I'm looking forward to that. And depending on how long I talk, Dave Bass may or may not get up and talk about Operation Trapped. But I'm really going to try to keep this thing on time tonight. All right. So every 3 months you got to put up with me, the law talking guy. Let's get this started. Okay. So thank you. I appreciate the appreciation. All right. In January of this year, there was a capital case, a death penalty case that came in front of the United States Supreme Court. It involved Florida's what's called their capital sentencing scheme. By what method do they use to put people to death? And of course, we all have a right to a jury trial. And indeed, in Florida, if you're charged with a death penalty offense, you do get the right to a jury trial. However, there's then a penalty phase jury, and instead of that penalty phase jury, if you're convicted of the murder in the first place, instead of them making the decision that yes, you're going to get the death penalty, or no, you're not going to get the death penalty, they make a recommendation. And then there's a third phase, which goes completely to the judge. And the judge decides what are supposedly the aggravating and mitigating factors. And this isn't a death penalty seminar, but the Supreme Court has ruled in the past that for it to be constitutional, both the bad and good things, the aggravating and mitigating circumstances about this defendant in particular, must be considered. And yet Florida has never seen fit that that important component of whether or not somebody gets the death penalty is decided by a jury. And I don't practice in Florida. I don't know how long Florida lawyers have been complaining about this, but that would seem to violate your right to a jury trial, is to have the jury decide the punishment in terms of whether or not 12 people have to decide that you get the death penalty, or only one person who's an elected judge. The court ruled that the Sixth Amendment requires a jury, not a judge, to find each fact necessary to impose a sentence of death, and a jury's recommendation is not enough. This is an example of the state wanting to do as little work as possible to get the result that they want. If the state only has to go to an elected official, a district court judge, who's got to run again and explain to his voters why he didn't impose the death penalty in a particular case, that's going to be a lot easier for them to get that death penalty ruling from that judge than to convince 12 folks. By the way, these folks are already what are called death qualified. In other words, that's what it's called. If you are called for jury duty in a capital case and you say, for religious reasons, moral reasons, ethical reasons, public policy reasons, for made-up reasons, for any reason, I do not believe that I could impose the death penalty because I am opposed to the death penalty, the government will tell you, thank you very much, you can leave now. And indeed, you are stricken from the jury. So death penalty defendants already get 12 folks that may not be eager to pull the switch, but at least have not haven't shown a whole lot of qualms about our death penalty system as it is. So that was an important case. That was one of the first, I think that was the first criminal case that the Supreme Court decided this year. All right. The Supreme Court then also in January, and then later on we'll talk about the other one, talked about the issue of something called retroactivity. Pretty much the Supreme Court is supposed to only take cases when they're big, interesting, novel issues of law that have not been settled before. So whenever the Supreme Court decides something, they're the ultimate court in the land, and issues come up where this particular defendant, this particular criminal defendant, may win or lose. And if the defendant supposedly wins, either usually getting a new trial, it usually doesn't get them off completely, but they get a fairer trial for some sort, it is true that any lawyer worth his salt is going to bring up that issue in the future. Well, what about the people that are sitting in prison or sitting on death row that were tried under that unfair system that happened before, that the Supreme Court has now decided is unconstitutional and is not the proper way for the government to incarcerate its citizens? That's what's meant by retroactivity. You would think, I would hope, but I know better, that suddenly everybody would get their new fair trial, but that's not how it works. So in a case called Miller versus Alabama, which was actually 4 years ago, the United States Supreme Court held that a juvenile that was convicted of a homicide be sentenced to life in prison without parole automatically. There had to be some sort of consideration about this particular child and whether or not they should have some opportunity at parole in the future. And Alabama was one of many states that, even though, depending on the age of the defendant, they weren't actually allowed to kill the defendant in a death penalty case for a juvenile, had automatic sentences without the possibility of parole. And 4 years ago, the Supreme Court decided that that was unconstitutional, that there could be cases where it would be appropriate for even a juvenile to be sentenced to prison without any chance of ever getting back, but those would be unusual and rare, and certainly not automatic. So this year, there came a case from Louisiana, and it was not a new case. The defendant was 69 years old, been incarcerated for more than 50 years on a automatic life without parole sentence. And the state argued to the Supreme Court that whether or not he had the opportunity, not a guarantee, but even an opportunity to ever get out again after more than 50 years in prison for what may have been a heinous crime 50 years ago, that that constitutional right to have that opportunity was not what's called substantive. They like to make the distinction between constitutional issues that are substantive and constitutional issues that are procedural. I think it's a false dichotomy, personally, but again, it's a way for the state to get to win when they've already been told that they shouldn't get to win, and that's what they argued, and the Supreme Court shot them down. Now, if you can imagine, if the word substantive means anything to you, I think you would consider it a pretty substantive issue as to whether or not you ever had the opportunity to ever get out, just to go ask a parole board at some point, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, to show maybe that you had been rehabilitated and that you were no longer a danger to society. And the truth is that the worst 16-year-old is probably not going to be a very dangerous 69-year-old. So, at any rate, one of the reasons I'm talking about this case is, and that's obviously, from a criminal defense lawyer's perspective, the proper result for particular clients that I might advocate for. But this will not be the case, this is my prediction for you, this will not be the case when, and I no longer say if, when we change the marijuana laws in Texas, we're still going to have folks mostly with criminal records. Most of them aren't going to be in prison, but some of them are going to be in jails, some of them are going to be in prisons for really lengthy periods of time. And for reasons I won't necessarily go into tonight, unless you want to ask me about it afterwards, we have to change things through the legislative process. So when the legislature changes the law, they're only changing the law going forward. There's no retroactivity for that. So when, and let's hear some cheers for that, when we change these wrong laws in Texas, some of us are still going to have some work to do going back there and fighting for people that are either still in prison or jail, or at least are being affected by criminal histories for something they shouldn't have been charged with in the first place. But at least the Supreme Court got that one right. All right. Then in March, this one was pretty interesting. The discovery process, when you're charged with a crime, whether it is a misdemeanor possession of marijuana in Texas or whether it is a capital murder anywhere, is one of the real downfalls of our system. It is a real problem. Most of my clients believe that I have the right to get a police report and all the videotapes and all the witness statements, and basically that the state must have what's called an open file policy where they literally give me everything that they have. Now, from a practical standpoint, and believe it or not, this is actually because it's easier for the state, in things like a misdemeanor possession of marijuana, they do actually tend to turn everything over. But here's the deal. They're not legally required to do so. The law says, in its current state, that they are only required to give me things that tend to show that my client is innocent. And remember, these are the prosecutors that have the evidence to begin with. They have the police reports. They're the people that have made the decision that my client is guilty. I sure hope they've made that decision, because they certainly shouldn't be charging my client with either misdemeanor marijuana or murder if they're not firmly convinced of his guilt. And so through those tinted glasses, they get to decide what they do and what they don't give us. And again, while it's not a huge issue in marijuana cases, this particular Supreme Court case decided in March. I think it, oh yeah, it was a capital case. So this is a pretty serious thing. The defendant was put on trial for murder. He raised an alibi defense. He had an alibi. Alibi witness testified. And the primary witnesses for the state were what are called jailhouse snitches. Now, we know a lot about jailhouse snitches now and their unreliability, but there are some pretty classic things that the state has to turn over. Remember, things that are helpful to my client. In this particular case, there were several categories of things that they just decided not to give. They withheld police records showing that other inmates had information, the snitch, that cast doubt on the credibility of his statements. Those included one of them saying that the person who testified against the defendant had told other people in the jail that he had a bias against that person, and this is a quote, he wanted him to get the needle because he jacked over me. Now, if the state knows they're putting on a witness that has a bias against my client, it's really black letter law that they're supposed to turn that over. They failed to do that, and it was obviously intentional. Also, there was eventually uncovered, after the trial, testimony from other inmates that the testifying snitch convinced people that they should also testify against the defendant because it would help them get out of jail. Information known to the state, not turned over to the defense. And despite, this is really classic jury trial law. Somebody give me a shout out, tell me why you think somebody in jail would go tell the state, hey, I want to go testify in so-and-so's trial. What is that person's motivation? Are they doing it out of the goodness of their heart? They want to get out early. The state told the defense and the judge that this particular angel, this jailhouse angel, didn't even try to get a reduction in his sentence. Wasn't trying to get anything in return whatsoever. He just apparently felt the need to testify truthfully, and yet they knew, they had access to the information, and the defense did not, that he had multiple times come to them and said, I want a reduction in my sentence if I testify against this person. And the state lied about it and didn't tell the defense any of that. The jury didn't hear any of it. Remember, there's an alibi in this case. We're talking about potential actual innocence and these sorts of things not being turned over. There was a third category of things that deals with a medical history. Somebody testified that something happened and there was evidence that maybe it couldn't have based on a medical doctor. It's kind of boring. It's not as black letter law as the other sorts of things. The Supreme Court decided to do the right thing in this case once again. They ordered that this particular person should get a new trial because the state acted completely out of bounds when they refused to turn this stuff over. But probably more importantly, there are a lot of cases where the defense on appeal comes and complains and says that wrong in my trial, B is wrong, C is wrong, D is wrong, and E is wrong. And the appellate court goes through and says, well, A doesn't matter, B doesn't matter, C, D, and E, none of those individually, we're just deciding, we're not the jury, but we're deciding that none of those individually would have made a difference in this particular case. It's a totally illogical way of looking at things, but courts have been doing this for years. And defense lawyers have been arguing something called cumulative error, and that is that it's the opposite of harmless error. What I was just describing is known as harmless error, where an appellate court will come in and say, the state shouldn't have done this, but it didn't make a difference in the case. Now, how anyone can think that a panel of 3 sometimes, or 5 or 7 or 9 people can put themselves in the minds of the jury and know that it didn't matter, I don't know where they came up with that. But the interesting thing about this particular Supreme Court case was, not only did they do the right thing and give this guy a new trial, but they said that the analysis should have been effectively from a cumulative error standpoint, that there were so many things that went wrong that instead of taking each supposedly little wrong thing and looking at it individually and forgiving it, that they were going to hold it collectively against the state, and that inured to the defendant's benefit. Now, so how did this happen? I mean, and I don't really have a good answer for this, by the way. I'm going to warn you. You would think in a situation where the state is hiding all of these good facts for the defendant that they would manage to hide them on appeal as well. And the truth of the matter is that this sort of thing probably happens day after day in the criminal courthouse, and the criminal courthouses all over Texas, and the federal courthouses all over the United States, and yet the defendant isn't lucky enough to be able to somehow magically get the evidence after the fact. So I don't know if having an alibi for a murder and being put on death row and then getting a new trial is really lucky, but the truth is this guy got lucky that any of this came to light in the first place. This deals just generally with the philosophy of how much power do we want to give our government, and it's something that applies to the war on drugs and the war on marijuana users as well. All right. One more retroactivity case. This is a federal case, and it is a federal felony to be a felon and to be in possession of a firearm. It carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison unless you are prosecuted under something called the Armed Career Criminal Act. The Armed Career Criminal Act says that for people with certain types of felonies, and those are enumerated: burglary, arson, extortion, one that has the use, attempted use, or threatened use of physical force. So there are some very clearly defined things. If you have either one of those violent felonies, one of those specific violent felonies, or a serious drug offense, and you have three of those, instead of a minimum of 10 years, instead of a maximum of 10 years, I don't know if I said minimum, guys, before, it's a maximum of a 10-year sentence, you go to a minimum of a 15-year to life sentence if you have three of these, and you'd be surprised what counts as a serious drug offense. But that's not what this particular case was about. It's why it's appropriate for us, however. There is a clause that is known as the residual clause. The residual means whatever's left over, the residual. And the United States Congress wasn't satisfied by just putting arson and burglary and actual violent felonies in there. They put in these words: or an offense that otherwise involves conduct that presents a serious potential risk of physical injury to another. I've got a question. Who thinks maybe misdemeanor DWI could present a serious potential risk of physical injury to another? Hands? Anybody think reasonable people could disagree about whether or not Congress meant to include misdemeanor DWI in that when there wasn't a collision? What if there was no collision? Are you going to include that? There are a lot of offenses like that. DWI is the one that pops to mind for me. But this particular Supreme Court case with this particular defendant was going, again, from a maximum of 10 years to a minimum of 15 to potentially life based on this vague clause. And the legal principle at work here is that for something to be either something you can be put in prison for or put in prison for a longer period of time, the Congress has to write that in a very specific way so that you know what conduct is prohibited. And these lawyers came to the Supreme Court and said that just as a general matter, that residual clause was too vague, and that therefore their client shouldn't have been sentenced under the higher penalty range, and the Supreme Court agreed. So good for them. That actually was from a case a few years ago. Now we get back to this year's case, retroactivity. How many people do you think are sitting in there for 15 to life that should have an absolute maximum of 10 years and maybe an even lower sentence than 10 years? Does that sound like something that is substantive, something that makes a difference to that particular person, or is that just a slight procedural matter? The government came in and said, and this is an example actually of government laziness. What the government's real concern here is not fairness, it's not justice, it's, oh my gosh, we have all these people that we've put in prison for an illegally long sentence, and they're all going to come and complain. They're all going to get lawyers, and we're going to have a bunch of work to do. Yeah, I wish I were kidding. That is, I mean, I'm sure that's not what they actually said at the Supreme Court. I assume that they were smart enough not to do that. But again, this deals with just thinking about what the proper role of government is, and this particular term of the Supreme Court has started taking an interesting direction. Maybe we've been moving that way. So that's, I don't know if it's going to make a difference in the presidential election, but that's something to think about there as well. All right, so that's let me take a break from the Supreme Court and introduce Kevin Ludlow. He is running for Texas House of Representatives, District 46. I'm not going to read the entire thing off of his website, but I do love this first paragraph. So, as a Texas state representative, I would fight vehemently to end the so-called war on drugs in Texas. At an absolute minimum, Texas must follow suit with Colorado and Washington and allow the recreational use of marijuana. Going beyond this, Texas should lead the charge in abolishing the criminalization of personal drug consumption across the board. We're very happy to have him here to speak to us tonight. Please welcome Kevin Ludlow.
All right, I like to talk here. Thank you guys for having me so much. I wrote a few notes, but I'm mostly going to go off the cuff here. I've spoken a couple of times. I really appreciate everybody having me. The first thing that I wanted to talk about was the death penalty, because we were just talking about that. Fascinating. It's probably, above drugs, my most important topic. I've talked about it extensively on the campaign trail. I've talked about it just as a human being living in the world who disagrees with the concept of it. So I read a story the other day. I think this will be relevant to this particular group. Some of you probably heard it, but I read about this story about this kid in Idaho who apparently some of you may have already read this, you might know where I'm going with this, but apparently this kid had been caught at school. He was a high school kid, I think, maybe early college, but he'd been caught with some marijuana, and he was selling it. So anyways, the cops came up to him, they basically gave him the whole song and dance and said what was going to happen to him if he didn't comply with them, he didn't work with them. And what they wanted was an informant. So he became an informant, and apparently 6 months later, the kid wound up dead. They found him at the bottom of a river, and he had a backpack full of rocks. He'd been sunk, he'd been shot in the head. So when we talk about the death penalty, that's the type of death penalty that I think of when we're talking about relating this to the war on drugs. It's obviously a really tragic story, but to make you cry just a little bit more, what was worse about it was in Idaho, and of course very kind of conservative, we do everything ourselves, that type of thing, very rugged environment. His parents, I think his mother specifically, gave a quote saying how in Idaho we don't sue, right? Like everybody's at their word. So they're suing the bejesus out of them right now, and I certainly hope that they win. But it was just such a touching story for me in like the most horrific way to read about. I don't have children. I don't know if anybody here has children, maybe somebody, but right there. But it sounds like a pretty awful thing to go through, especially on the basis of the fact that this kid was caught selling marijuana of all things. I'm pretty sure there's a few people here who have also done that. So to wind up dead in a river sounds pretty terrible. Anyways, my name is Kevin Ludlow. Sorry to start on that note of joy and happiness. I am running for the Texas House of Representatives. I ran in 2014. I'm running again in 2006. Not win in 2014. If I had, there would have been at least one voice for marijuana in the state house. Thank you. I'm running as a libertarian candidate. Are there any of those here? Oh, that's pretty good. Everybody else is a Trump supporter, I assume. Oh, so sorry. This is going to sound a little weird, but normally when I've spoken on this stage before, it's a political thing, and I am running for the Texas House. I've typically dressed up a little bit. I try to put on shoes, try to put on jeans, maybe a nice shirt, what have you. Tonight I didn't do that, and I'm going somewhere with that. The reason I didn't do it is because in the last 4 years of actually working as a candidate inside of the Libertarian Party, inside of the Texas House of Representatives and what have you, I've learned, And this is to not discredit the idea of running for politics. I love it, and I think everybody here should do it. But I've learned over the last few years that the only thing that's substantially more important than running for politics specifically are activists. Everybody in this particular room right now. And thank you. And I know there's a bunch of you that feel that way specifically, who probably, some of you probably don't even vote, think that you shouldn't vote. I don't necessarily agree with that position, but I completely understand why you do it, or for that matter, why you don't. But the reality is that the activists, the activism groups around this country, or certainly around the state, around the city, I think have done more for the political system than any politician that we've got right now. So for those of you who are not libertarian, you're voting for Trump, you're voting for Hillary, I don't know. Right, or Jill Stein, right. So I was going to go somewhere with that, whoever just threw that out there. I'm a big supporter of Jill Stein as well. I'm a big supporter of Gary Johnson. I'm really into third-party politics. That's why I run as a libertarian. That's why I'm so passionate about the Libertarian Party. You know, I don't think that the two front contenders are going to give us very much. I don't think most of you think that either. I was happy, for those of you in the room who are big Bernie supporters, I was very happy with a lot of the conversations that he brought up. I think just talking about the fact that we need to have these conversations, they need to be in the debates, etc. That's a huge component to what's going on right now. So I'm hoping that since he's not going to get in, that our candidate, Gary Johnson, is going to bring some of those topics, and I'm hoping that he gets in the debate. So if you get an opportunity, or those of you who do vote, please certainly do consider throwing your vote towards a third party, be it Gary Johnson or Jill Stein or another one. There's a few other ones as well, but those are the two, probably the two leading ones. So going back to that, the whole dress thing and the notion of activism and what have you, I've kind of learned over the last several years of doing it and really, really being involved inside of the Libertarian Party and politics in general, that I think, like I said, that the activist groups among us here are probably doing more for the political causes than anything else. In fact, just this past year, I've served on the Libertarian National Committee for the last two plus years. It's a body of 18 people that oversee, I don't know, ostensibly a few million people across the country that are active members of the Libertarian Party. It was really great. I go to quarterly meetings all over the country, meet with really interesting people. We try to set policy for the Libertarian Party, and I'm very passionate about that, and I really do believe in what they're doing. About 4 or 5 months ago, very publicly, I got into a fairly big and, I guess, cantankerous debate with with the executive director, frankly, of the party, and we were talking about that exact point, and we were trying to figure out, you know, should the Libertarian Party be an activist group or should they be a political party? And this is kind of an ongoing conversation. Anybody who's involved probably has heard of it, you know, to no end. But I was making the point that we should be a political party because I do think that there is a tremendous value for having third-party candidates, even if they're completely marginalized, they're a fraction of whatever the conversation is. Just having them inside of the conversation is what allows us to change that conversation. For example, I'm not going to go into the way that the privatized presidential debate commission works, but for anybody who's curious about it, come and talk to me afterwards. But in any case, it's virtually impossible to get into that process because the very metric that allows you to get into it is something that the media doesn't give you access to in the first place. So for example, Gary Johnson, he's currently the best of the third-party candidates with respect to the numbers right now. He needs to get 15% in the polls in order just to debate, just for you guys to hear him, for those of you who have not heard him. And the unfortunate reality of that is the very polls that he has to get into, the media controls that, so they don't have to take polls of him in the first place. There was one that came out just a few weeks ago that had Hillary, it had Donald, and then it had other name, something to that effect. It didn't actually say even his name. So these are the realities of you know, that process. And this is a very legitimate candidate, as I believe Jill Stein is as well for the people who are supporting her. So I just happen to be a Gary supporter. So. But the conversation I got into with the executive director was essentially talking about the amount of work that activist groups do versus what what political parties are actually able to accomplish. And don't get me wrong, I don't think for a second that either the Democratic or Republican Party is really interested in helping anybody in this room with respect to their desire to maybe see marijuana legalized, or maybe take people out of prison for it, or in general not put people in cages for nonviolent offenses. I think that that's probably pretty much right up their agenda to do that. I do think, however, that some of the third parties, predominantly the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, are very much in step with that, and I support that, of course. But the reality is that they also have kind of an identity crisis inside of the political system, and it's mostly because they've been so marginalized, and so the people who are climbing to the top, of course, are having to really claw their way up there just to get anything, right? And I can't imagine being in that position. You know, I've run for a state house position a few times, but you don't get a lot of attention to begin with. So if I started getting a tremendous amount of attention, I'm not really sure exactly what I would say. Maybe I would be a little bit more willing to say some things that I don't 100% agree with in order for people to hear 90% of what I want them to hear, or at least what I'm very passionate about. So I think that's really what's going on right now. The activist groups, though, the reason I had this conversation with the executive director is to point out that in the last 41 years that the Libertarian Party has been around, try as they might, they haven't actually succeeded in various libertarian mechanisms. They haven't successfully changed marijuana laws. They haven't successfully helped the gay community to have equal rights and things of that, successfully helped women's rights, etc. However, activist groups really have. And I think if we're talking about the gay community, I think that they've done, the pride groups in general have done tremendous efforts to change the mindset of the United States, people in the country and people all around the world. And I think groups like NORML, specifically, I'm involved with TXNORML, all of you guys, have done absolutely wonderful things to try to change policy at the legislative level. So this is very exciting to me, and I can't stress enough to you guys how wonderful it is to have all of you out here. It's a Wednesday night. You could be doing anything else with your time, and yet here you are listening to this guy in shorts and sandals on a stage right now. So I really appreciate that. The biggest thing, though, going back to the death penalty, or at least segueing from that, and this is kind of another topic of mine, is with respect to the militarization of the police forces. This is a very, very huge issue to me. It's something that I worked on I've worked on it for, I don't know, probably 10 or 15 years as it's escalated over, mostly a post 9/11 sort of society, which I even kick myself for saying that phrase. It's so stupid. But in any case, you all know what I'm referring to. So that was something very, very big in my campaign. It sits atop the war on drugs, and obviously that's the thing that's hurting us, I think, the most. A couple of quick statistics. These are things that I threw out readily on the campaign trail in 2014. Weirdly, and let's just go right into the race thing. I was running against a 22-year incumbent who happens to be an African-American woman who's a Democrat. That is a difficult obstacle to tackle in Austin, Texas, let me tell you. But at the same time, her policies certainly have never advocated anything for that particular community. They've certainly never advocated anything for me, and I, obviously, in the district if I'm running. And as it happens, I just jumped the gun on this one, but I did file criminal charges against her in 2014 because she was evading all of her ethical violations. So many of you may have read about her in the paper in the last probably 3 to 4 months. Her name is Donna Dukes. I'm hoping that she gets indicted after all. The Texas Rangers are investigating her right now because she has very seriously abused her campaign finance money. But where I was going with the race issue in general, because this is something, again, it ties into the militarization of the police, and I'm very passionate about this. And I know it's a sore subject or a difficult subject to broach with many people, but I really believe that we need to be open to talking about it. I don't think that we should hide behind this and feel uncomfortable with these particular statistics, or even mentioning like the difference, the realistic difference between the black and white community. Obviously, I don't believe for a second that there should be one, but the statistics certainly say otherwise. So, for example, 62% in this country of all drug offenders are African American. It's a fact, and yet that's right, and yet they only comprise roughly 12% of the population. So go figure how that particular thing works. If you're African American, you're 13 times more likely to be incarcerated for some sort of nonviolent drug offense. And on top of that, 50%, you guys all know this statistic, but over 50% right now, I believe, of all people who are in prison are for nonviolent drug offenses. This is obviously something that you guys are fighting tooth and nail to stop. So the race thing for me, I can't even explain why it's such a big deal, but it just really is. And I've talked about it for years. I ran a campaign against it. So one of the things I wanted to, I like to do when I get to talk or just tell little stories. Just this past weekend was the 4th of July. I'm sure most of you guys remember it, or most of it anyways. That's right. So I had a really nice dinner on the Friday before the 4th of July, and I had painted my toenails, because I like to get pedicures. I painted them with the red, white, and blue, the flag, and all that sort of thing. And anyways, I was at a lovely dinner party, and I had a conversation with a woman who I don't know that well, but I have hung out with her a couple of times, a friend. And in any case, we were talking about patriotism and nationalism in general, and she assumed that I was very nationalistic given that I had my toenails painted, but I was pointing out to her that I was being extremely ironic, and I'm not sure that went over entirely well, but the reality is why, what the question behind it, and we eventually got to that. And I think the question was pretty well received. And why am I being so ironic about that particular point? Why am I not more nationalistic? Well, I think, of course, like probably some of you in this room do, I think it's a very dangerous thing given where we currently live right now, given what's going on in this country. Segued, thank you, whoever's clapping. I appreciate that. Segueing from the militarization of police, looking at racial disparages in all sorts of things, but in this particular group, let's talk about drug reform and marijuana specifically. There are so many violent, horrific injustices that are going on right now in this country, and so many of them circulate around the war on drugs. It's insanity. And I am wonderfully optimistic that the laws will start changing, but as they're changing, I don't know how many more people are going to be incarcerated, or going to be killed, or going to be violated in some particular way. So I'm really hoping that changes very quickly, and the point of the conversation that I had with this woman was just to say that I'm, as in theory, patriotic of a person as one could be. Unfortunately, I don't agree at all with what's happening in the United States right now, and I can't very well get behind an organization. I cannot get behind an organization, i.e. the United States government, that believes, that distributes, that disseminates this type of information, this type of fear culture, this mindset to its citizenry, and then subjugates them further through violent means. I don't believe in that at all. So some of you have heard this story before, but very briefly, and I'm going to leave you with this story. I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me in 2014. It's kind of an interesting story. When I was running for the Texas State House of Representatives in 2014, I had my house broken into by police officers. And the backstory is basically that I had a house cleaner at my house that day. And we won't get into all the details of what ultimately transpired. Or another, somebody called the police for a suspicious person inside of the house. I was at work, and I don't work very far, but I was at the office. And so somebody called it in, a bunch of police showed up apparently. She called me, was scared, and she said, "There's police at your door." I said, "Well, that's okay, you're at my house, you're my house cleaner." And I was like, "Why don't you, I'm on the phone with her." I was like, "Why don't you put them on the phone?" So they did. And in any case, I forget the detective's or the officer's name at this point, but apparently he had walked out through my back door. He took her phone and walked through the back door. He starts talking with me, and I said, "Well, I understand that you guys got called. What's the deal? There's a suspicious person. That's my house cleaner. She's allowed to be there." And he's like, "Well, that's all fine and good, Mr. Ludlow. We understand. But there's a strong odor of marijuana coming from your house." Now, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, and this is not, I smoke pot all the time, but this is not a lie. There was not any marijuana in the house. I know as a fact. It was all gone. And it's true. But anyways, What I didn't know at this moment, what I said to the police officer was, I said, okay, well, that's all fine and good, but what happened to I've quickly dismissed it because in my rational mindset, that's not an issue that's hurting anybody. What could be hurting somebody is if there actually is a suspicious person hanging out at my house who's not my housekeeper. That strikes me as a fairly substantial detail about that. And he said, okay, well, we'll do that. You have to prove that she's your house cleaner. And I'm just going to go ahead and kill the foreshadowing here. He was tricking me. He was totally tricking me. But he told me essentially, he's like, well, we could be talking to anybody. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to come home and prove to us that this is your house. It actually, I mean, I'm very, very distrusting of the police. I hope the last 10 minutes illustrated that a little bit. But in any case, in authoritative figures in general. But in this case, rationally speaking, logically speaking, I thought it sounded pretty sound. He could be talking to anybody, so I said, okay, I'll drive home and I'll use my key and you can see it's my house and see the ID if you need to. It matches the address, that sort of thing. So anyways, when I pull up to my house, there's 3 police cars, and of course they can't just park nice and neat. I would have parallel parked, but they're all parked like, there's some massive robbery going on and that sort of thing, blocking the street and everything, lights on. It's just ridiculous. But I was like, all right, well, this is an interesting situation. And so I walk up to the door and I turn the key. And right when I turn the key, I'm expecting to get inside, but he opens the door right beforehand. And there's 2 police officers inside. And I mean, I know I'm pretty muscly and everything, but they were quite a bit bigger than me. And on my piano bench, my house cleaner is sitting there. And I'm going to go ahead and spoil this too. She's pretty friendly to the marijuana scene. So she was just sitting there very silently. And have a nice relationship, and she gives me this glance where I immediately knew, like, well, this is different than I thought. And so surprisingly, the police officers did let me set up my camera. So I had a really nice camera in the house, and I set it up. They followed. And anyways, it took about, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6 minutes for this whole thing to de-escalate. And I was being very calm. I was trying to be very nice to them and all this sort of stuff. And I'm running for the Texas House of Representatives at this point. This is October 1st, 2014. The election was November 4th, so 33 days away. And here's these 2 officers just standing in my house. And to anybody who's ever experienced this, this is a horrible experience. I don't want anybody in my house that I haven't invited inside of it, much less 2 guys standing there way bigger than me in jack boots with guns on their sides. This is not something that I like to come home to, especially while they've got my maid ostensibly detained right there. So, and I haven't done anything wrong. I mean, I've been at work all day. So, anyways, long story short, the officers and I have a long conversation. We go through this whole rigmarole. Eventually, what they're trying to do is determine if they're actually gonna haul me off to jail. And I'm standing there. I try to call my attorney, who some of you may know is a guy named Jamie Balagia. Yeah, that's right. So I picked up the phone to call Jamie. And one of the police officers stops me. He says, "You can't, you can't." And some of you may have seen this on YouTube. The whole interaction has been out there for a few years. But anyways, he tells me that I can't make a phone call. To which I very calmly say, "Are you telling me that I cannot call an attorney under this particular situation?" He says, "At the moment, you're being detained for suspicion of such and such. You cannot use your phone right now. It's a safety issue. Please sit down." The other officer goes on to say, "Like, we don't know if you've got weapons hidden. You really need to sit down on the couch." So he kind of alludes to the fact that I might have weapons hidden in my couch and then tells me to sit on my couch. There are no weapons hidden inside of my couch. There may have been some marijuana, but it was all. So anyway, so they eventually take off. And when they ask me, towards the end of it, they say, well, we don't know who you are, so that's why we're here. Well, as it happened, like I said, I may have mentioned I was running for the Texas House of Representatives. There was a 8-foot by 4-foot, so 32 square feet to the math majors here, of a billboard with my giant head on it. And I pointed to it and said, well, I think it's awfully clear who I am at the moment. And so they're like, yes, we understand that you're running for the Texas House and that sort of thing. And so they were a little condescending, but eventually they take off. And what happened, though, and here's the part that should really freak some of you guys out, I think, because I didn't get to see this. I wasn't there for it. But when they came to the house, when this whole thing happened and my house cleaner was interacting with them and everything, They instantly detained her, sat her down, of course wouldn't let her move. And somebody in this room, I'm certain, can tell me if this is true or not, but I'm pretty sure there's a Supreme Court thing now that says that the odor of marijuana is not probable cause for search anymore. Is that accurate? All right. We won't go into it, but so there's that. But anyways, they didn't actually search the property per se. From what I'm told through my house cleaner, who again I have a very nice relationship with, and she's very like hip to this stuff. She told me that instead what they claimed was that they feared for their lives. And so they drew their firearms and they actually searched the house, going room to room, because they didn't know if anybody else was in the house, right? And it's my understanding from having spoken with Jamie and some other people that what they were doing was hoping that I had some sort of paraphernalia of any kind out somewhere, because had they seen that, then at that point now they've got immediate probable cause to do whatever they want to do inside of the house. So, I mean, to me, this is a horrible thought to think that I'm employing somebody at my house who has had to deal with police officers detaining her, pulling firearms, not necessarily on her, but in front of her, searching my house, all at the suspicion that there might be marijuana, which some of you may have heard is not really the worst thing that you could possibly take. So, anyways, this is pretty much how it went. They eventually left. No charges were filed, of course. And I'm gonna chalk that back to the race thing, and the fact that I was a dude in a nice house running for Texas House of Representatives. Obviously, there's going to be some sort of hell to pay if they're actually going to try to prosecute me. Most people don't afford it to them, and that's why I spend my time working with groups like TXNORML, running for the Texas State House of Representatives, and otherwise trying to change these absolutely archaic and horrific laws. I really appreciate every single person in this room doing the exact same thing. I so appreciate you guys being out on Wednesday night. Thank you so much to TXNORML for having me. Jax, always appreciate you inviting me, and I'll see you next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. A couple of things real quickly on that. So in some of the states where they've either gone fully legal or at least partially legal with medical, some of the state Supreme Courts have said that the odor of marijuana is not necessarily probable cause to search. In Texas, we're still fully illegal. So it's not a United States Supreme Court thing. I don't know how they'll... that particular issue hasn't gone to the United States Supreme Court. That reminds me, don't hotbox your car. Quick free legal advice. Okay. And don't eat your weed. Who's seen that? Don't eat your weed. You can Google it. It's some lawyers with some guitars. You really can turn your Class B misdemeanor marijuana, which we can get it dismissed. Don't freak out. You'll turn it into a third-degree felony. So don't do that. They're going to take your weed either way, Matt. All right. And so next up, actually, we're going to have Jax come up, is that right, and talk about upcoming events?
Hello, everybody. How y'all doing? I can't with this mic, though, you guys. How are y'all? Good? Hello, this side of the room. Hello, that side of the room. Hello, YouTube. How are you doing today? All right, so I want to tell you guys about some events that we have coming up. We have a lot of really cool stuff that we're working on. So, of course, you're at our open meeting right now. And later this month, on the 16th, there's going to be a patient empowerment meeting at the Capitol. And we're going to have Nisha Whiteley from My Chronic Relief speak about the endocannabinoid system. And also we're going to do breakouts to work on testimony. So if you're a patient and you're interested in that, definitely look for that event page. That's going to be something really good to prepare you for the upcoming session for when it is time for hearings. Because even though it's the summer, session really isn't that far away. Also, we'll be here at Flamingo Cantina again next month on the 3rd. First Wednesday of every month, you can come and find us here. Tip your bartender. Thank you, Flamingo Cantina. We've been here like 4 or 5 years now, you guys. It's pretty awesome. We love Flamingo. And after that, we are going to be at the Austin Pride Festival and Parade. We're very excited. We're very excited about that. So we're going to have a booth at the festival. And you can find the information about that festival online. It's going to be at Fiesta Gardens on August 27th. And then if you guys saw the truth enforcement vehicle outside, we're going to have Truthy in the parade. And we can have up to 150 people march with us. Yeah, so if you want to march with Truthy and support the LGBT community, then make sure you sign up online because we only get 150 people. So we have an event page with a form you can fill out so you can participate in the parade. After that, we will be back here again in September, of course, first Wednesday of every month. And then we're actually going to be doing some traveling activist trainings. We did some last fall, and we're doing some again this fall. Last fall, we kind of focused on elections, how to make sure that we get our representatives that really represent us elected. And this time, we're going to be focusing more on My Texas Legislature Online. We're going to be focusing more on lobbying and preparing for that, which it's a whole different beast than elections. So we're going to be going to Amarillo, Lubbock, Tyler, DFW, RGV. Carlo's here today. We're very happy that you drove all the way, Carlo. And we're also going to be going to Corpus Christi, San Antonio, Houston, El Paso. So it's a lot of stuff, you guys. Oh. Also in November, there will be another PACT meeting. You can find that event online. That one will focus even more so on lobbying because we're going to be getting closer to that. In October, we're going to be having our Veterans Conference on October 15th. We're really excited about that. We're going to have Dean Bortel and Team Alexis there as our keynote speakers. And we're going to, yes, Team Alexis. And then we're going to have, ooh, is it a singing night tonight? I don't know. We'll see what happens. We're going to have some other speakers there. We're working out the agenda, but make sure you save the date for that. We're really excited to have that event coming up. And then in October, we're going to have our members mixer. How many people have been to a members mixer before? It's fun. It's fun. You'd like it. You'd like it. It's a private party. You get presents. It's at a secret location. It's fabulous. Oh, it's getting sing-songy, you guys. We're going to do it a little different this year, though. We're going to start a little bit earlier, and we're going to set up 3 disc golf baskets. We're going to set up bocce ball. We're going to have card games and dominoes and all that good stuff so that we can have some fun activities. And then we're going to transition into dinner and the costume contest. All the while, we will have DJs spinning, and we will have the Texas KGB playing live for us at the event, too. What? So it's going to be a really, really awesome event. We're going to have tickets available within the next couple weeks, so we'll announce that on our social media whenever those come up. After that, elections, you guys. So you need to make sure that you are registered to vote, write it down, by October 11th. That is your deadline. Okay? And then from the end of October to the beginning of November, you can do early voting. And then Election Day is on the 8th. And get this, you can start pre-filing a deadline on November 14th. So like a week after you're elected, you can start putting forth legislation and pre-filing it. So this is going to be really key to having a bill make it through the whole marathon that is the legislature, is making sure that we find representatives to pre-file bills so that they are starting at the very beginning, right out the gate, getting pre-filed and getting ready so that they can get on the calendars, get into the committees, and move forward through the process. So that leads me to what should you be doing, right? What can you do to make sure that we're preparing for the lobby session, the legislative session coming up? First thing you can do, of course, register to vote. We talked about that, right? And then actually go vote. But here's the thing. There's a lot of districts in Texas that are so gerrymandered that if you are an incumbent of the correct political party for that district, you're almost guaranteed to win. There are very few districts that are highly competitive. So let me tell you, if you have an incumbent in your district, you need to start visiting them now. Go call the office, ask to come and sit down with the staffer, start to make a relationship with the office, because there is a very high likelihood that that person is going to be reelected. Now, things can change. You know, things can become competitive, but that's the reality of the beast, is right now is when you need to be making a relationship with whoever that incumbent is in your district. And of course, still go out and support your candidate if that's not the incumbent, but the incumbent still needs to know who you are and that you care about medical marijuana, decriminalization, full legalization. They need to know where you stand on those issues. So that is what we need to work on until the legislature convenes in January. Just to give you a brief overview, I actually have a timeline all the way out till May of next year. I won't read it all to you because it's 4 pages long. But an overview is that during the legislative we're going to be having 2 educational exhibits down in the hearing hallway. One will be based on medical marijuana, and one will be based on civil penalties, removing the criminal penalty and changing it to a civil penalty. So we'll have a full display down in the hearing hallway for 2 different weeks. So that's going to be really awesome. And we're going to need volunteers to come and help us staff that. So make sure you reach out to volunteer@texasnormal.org for that. And we're also going to be doing legislative briefings so that we can educate the staffers, because the representatives and senators really lean into their staff. And so it's really important that the staff is educated. And so we're going to be doing that type of thing. And then of course there's going to be hearings. There's going to be all kinds of things are going to pop up at the last minute. So be prepared that basically January through May, you need to be like, ready. Are you ready? You got to be ready. Okay. You need a 3-minute testimony if you're going to testify. Go ahead and start practicing writing that now, looking for your resources that you want to quote in your testimony. So very important stuff is going on. And you can learn about that at the PACT meeting on the 16th of this month. So there's a lot to do. And fortunately, we have a really awesome group here at Texas Normal. A lot of people that volunteer and donate their time. In fact, we have 2 new advisors that have come on to help us. We've got Brittany over at the table. She's helping us with event planning. Sparkle fingers! And then we also have Kate, who's going to help us manage our membership, because it's a very important component. Yeah, it's very important. Membership, when you become a member, we connect you with what district you're in, and then we send you pinpointed alerts so that you know, hey, you're in this district, your representative is on X committee, and we need you to do Y. You know, so we send you pinpointed alerts. It's super important to being able to be effective is to really be able to reach out to the direct areas. So tonight we are having a special. If you join at the supporter level, we have some gift packages for you up at the table. So go and check out our membership and become a member. Your dues help us do all of this important work that we're doing up at the Capitol. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of energy, it's a lot of volunteers coming out and making sure that tasks are getting done. So if you are one of those volunteers, you make this organization run. You know who you are. I see you smiling real big. I see you. All right, so on that note, everybody, y'all better go to that table and find out not only about our membership, but what our mission is and some of the statistics about what's going on. So please stop by our table. And we're going to have some comedy here in a minute, so I'm not going to talk too much longer. But we have a whole bunch of events up on our Facebook page and on our website. So
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. We really appreciate the support. Please come up and talk to any of us about, well, anything, but obviously marijuana reform is what we're here for. Later, the Mau Mau chaplains are coming on. Some awesome reggae. But we're going to start now with the comedy portion of tonight. And our MC is a longtime fervent supporter of both marijuana reform and specifically Texas Normal. It's my pleasure to introduce our comedy MC for tonight, Mr. Chad Fisher.
What's up, everybody? How we doing? Let's make some noise for Miguel Gantina. You can always when a comedy show's about to start, because that's when everyone gets up and leaves the fucking room and shit. They're like, oh, comedy's starting? Oh, I think this is the perfect time to go, like, valet my car real fast. Even though it's already parked, but, you know, who gives a shit? How's everybody feeling this evening? We feeling good? Fucking July? Is July? Yeah, so it's great to be here. How many This is a dumb question. How many weed smokers we got in the audience here tonight? It's some noise. I'm just asking because I sell weed and I need to know who to approach afterwards. That's it. My lawyer is super pissed that I just said that, but hey, Jamie. I love smoking weed, okay? Big time. I smoke so much weed that I forget to smoke weed sometimes. I'm like, holy shit. 6 p.m. and I just now realizing I haven't smoked? I'm time to get high, shit. I'm a big time pothead, love smoking weed, you know? You know you're a pothead when you smell a skunk and you think it smells good, like, god damn, we got some dank in here, shit. Can I hit it just once? They're like, that's a skunk. Well, I don't give a shit, roll it up right now. You know, when I was a kid, I used to be repulsed by the smell of a skunk. Now I immediately just get the munchies and want to talk about 9/11 conspiracies. Jump right to the chase. How many people, round of applause real quick, how many people here would probably be in jail if it wasn't for weed? Was fucking weed? Yeah, here we go. And I would too, you know. I definitely would be. There's so many times, there's people that owe me money and stuff like that. I get so pissed off, I'm like, oh, I'm about to beat this dude's ass. I'm gonna key his car and all this shit. I smoke weed and I'm like, you know what? I guess he's just on his own little journey, you know, fuck it. Let him be. Who cares? Right? What's up, brother? Let's go for Flamingo Cantina. It's the shit. I love coming to Flamingo. It's the shit. I love that we can smoke weed here. It's awesome. A lot of times I'll go to other bars and stuff like that and forget that I'm not at Flamingo and I just start sparking up a joint. They come out, they're like, you can't do that here, buddy. I'm like, the fuck? It's like it's like Roadhouse in here. Jesus Christ. What's going on? You know, I hate when the mainstream news, you guys hate this, the mainstream news always says some really dumb shit about smoking weed. They always say like marijuana is the gateway drug. Like, oh, marijuana is the gateway drug. You know, the next step is just heroin. That shit pisses me off, right? It really pisses me off. Because we all know the next step is mushrooms, right? Not heroin. It's gonna jump right into the deep end. Get our toes wet a little bit. Feel it out. There you go. Yeah, I like that. You just come in here laughing. That's what I'm talking about. So shit. Anybody voting in this next election? Round of applause. Who's voting? Okay, I got a burning question. You guys can just shout this out. I've been wondering this shit for a long time. We'll just shout it out. How big do you think Hillary Clinton's dick is? Can we just go ahead, shout it out? 10 inches? It's a big ass dick. Girl slanging some dick around and shit. I can't, what's that? Yeah, that's hilarious, bro. It's funny as hell. I saw a couple weeks ago Hillary Clinton was campaigning, right? And she was in Harlem. And she played some dominoes in Harlem, right? And played dominoes in Harlem. Like, that's racist as shit, right? The fuck? What's next? Is she gonna sag her pants in the Bronx? She gonna buy an unregistered weapon on Chacon Street? Like, come on. No better than this. She was on a Philadelphia radio station recently, and it was a predominantly black radio station. She was obviously pandering to the black audience, and she said, you know, always keep a jar of hot sauce in my purse. You're like, really, Hillary? A jar of hot sauce? Is it right next to the 10-inch strap-on dildo you keep in there as well? It's a good place to end there. We got a couple more really funny comics for you guys this evening. Next comic, one of my best friends, super funny guy. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Mikey Swenson.
Yeah, make as much noise as you have smoked today or something. Fuck yeah. Guess what? I stopped smoking weed. Sorry. You know why I stopped smoking weed, ma'am? Do you know why? It's because I found weed in my belly button. Can you believe that shit? I found weed in my belly button. I was like, good lord, I've got to stop smoking weed. Right after I smoked this weed I found in my belly button, fuck, what am I? It's got my juices on it. Hi, folks. How are you? Yeah? You still into this shit? You ready for chubby Matt Damon with glasses to tell you jokes? You ready for the born obesity up here? Wow! Ocean's 11-inch sub? Huh? Rounders? That one writes itself. The talented yet unmotivated Mr. Ripley. Have you seen that one? Seen all these fucking Fat Damon movies. Give it up for Fat Damon. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We are. Give it up for my trainer, who is also a bot. Everyone's like, weed makes you lazy. This guy's like running around trails, and I'm behind him throwing up sausage I ate. Fuck, man. You know what's funny? I used to think that exercise was like good all the time now that I started to exercise, so I think they're wrong. Yeah, fuck you, man. Makes me feel terrible. I quit smoking and drinking, like, this is health. Then I started running, I'm like, this is not health. This hurts. This is no good. And I hate the sun now. I used to like the sun. I used to stay inside and be like, it's out there making things grow and keeping the planet warm. Now I'm like, fuck the sun. I don't like the sun, I like the moon. I like the moon, yeah, give it up for the moon! Give it up for the moon, everybody! Good Lord. It's hard, man. It's hard not smoking weed in these days, you know? There's fucking crazy shit going on all the time. Shit blows up in this country. There's shootings. ISIS shot up a gay club. Why did they do that? Like, gay people are gonna be like, okay, well, stop. Jeez, if you're gonna keep shooting, it's not gonna work. I'm done now. Like, what the fuck did they expect to happen? You just shoot them, they're like, we're gonna have 4 more parades now, and we're gonna be armed. ISIS is like, I think it backfired. Oh no. But I mean, seriously, if there is one city that can take a hit to its gay population, it's Orlando, am I right? I mean, Christ. It's all glitter factories and magic castles. You know what I'm saying? Uncomfortable? Okay, sorry. Forgot we were political here. Fuck. Should I get even more political? I know who did 9/11. Would you like to know who did 9/11? I did research back when I was smoking all that weed. I didn't just sit around. I mean, I did, but I looked shit up. You know who did 9/11? Hoops. You know, before 9/11, not doing well. After 9/11, they're doing great all of a sudden. That's who did 9/11. That's right, it was Toby Keith committed 9/11. He must have. It must have been Toby. He had this song about putting a boot in somebody's ass. He's like, fuck, man, are we still at war with Kosovo? Shit, can we start a war on an abstract now that'll never end and we'll just sell these records, man? Fuck. I like that. You know, it's like, sometimes I expect people to laugh, but most people go,